So for this video, I wanted to do a little bit of an author spotlight, I guess a lot of people call it, but on my channel I thought I would call it, you know, something like, basically where you take like 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how long the books are, I guess, books, not necessarily in a series, but by the same author. And I figured I would just call it, you know, let's try 2 by or 3 by or whatever, and then the author's name. So that's sort of the start of this. I want to focus on the UK author, Jane Green. Did I get her name right? Yes. Okay. My brain's a little bit tired right now. It's close to 4 in the morning when I'm filming this, so my thoughts might come in and out. So Jane Green has been recommended to me on and off the last couple years with the book group I'm in, and then various people on BookTube and different like bookish social media sites I use. Her name keeps coming up for some reason on like bookish circles I hang out in online. For some reason, I can't quite figure out why, but for some reason I was sort of hesitant about trying it because I thought maybe she'd be a little bit fluffier than I tend to like. But people kept talking up her writing. So, you know, I do get influenced sometimes when I hear enough of a name come up. It does sort of strike my curiosity after a time. So I decided I'd just try a couple and see what I thought. So the first one I went with, I actually saw this at Barnes & Noble, oh gosh, I don't know, I think the beginning of last year sometime, and it was one they actually had in their discount rack. And again, I was sitting there and I had it in my hand and I was just on the fence about it, ended up putting it back, and then down the road ended up just getting a copy of Thrift Books, I think, because I'm a cheap bitch. So I picked up a copy of Saving Grace by Jane Green. I thought this one might be a good one to start with. I'm totally not having this in frame. I thought this would be a good one to start with because the synopsis of this sounded more thriller-esque than some of the fluffier titles I saw with her books. This one has to do with this lady, Grace. I keep getting this on the wrong side. I'm trying to manage books and a mug and all of this. I don't know how some of you do it. So this one's about Grace, who, when we meet her in the beginning of the novel, at that point she's been married 20 years to this guy, Ted Chapman, who is a crime novelist. And back in the day, he was a very well-loved, well-read, you know, highly popular, however you want to say it, novelist. But at this point, at the beginning of the book, his career is starting to wane a little bit. His last few books didn't sell that great. And also his personal assistant, I think of like 15 years, ends up unexpectedly leaving her post because her mom's situation with Alzheimer's gets a lot worse, and so she decides to leave her job to go take care of her mom. So the Chapmans are sort of up in the air about what to do with their their setup the way they had it. Grace is trying to manage the sudden leave of the assistant, but she's stressed out a little bit because she also has her own career she's trying to develop. She spent many years being the wife of Ted Chapman and doing that socially and everything, but she got to the point where she just wanted to do her own thing and have her own career finally and not live in the shadow of her husband. So she decides to pursue this culinary career she was interested in. And at the beginning of the novel, it's at the point where it's really starting to take off for her. And then this happens, and she's in that sort of limbo area of, you know, I want to do this thing, but I also have this sort of like home base guilt where I need to take care of my family, and which way do I go? And when she's sort of at her wit's end, and deciding to finally start interviewing for people to replace the old assistant through one of her friends or acquaintances. I forget how well she knows the person, but somebody introduces her to this girl Beth, who just happens to be looking for a job conveniently. Grace first meets her at a social function. Beth just happens to show up, and I think one of her friends there knows Beth a little bit and vouches for her, and Grace and Beth get to talking, and things are good at that initial meeting. So she was like, yeah, come by and have a more formal interview and get to see the place and all of that. And by the second time they meet, Grace has decided, yeah, Beth seems perfect. To the reader, when you're reading about it, she seems almost too perfect, and that's sort of the setup of the thriller aspect of the story. But Grace is clueless about a lot of that through a good portion of the at least the beginning parts of the story. So she hires Beth on, and everything seems great at first. Some of Grace's friends address the fact that Beth is much younger than the previous assistant and female, and don't you worry about your husband's eye wandering. And Grace finds comfort in the fact that Beth, her personality, she's very shy, mousy type. She wears sort of dowdy clothes and just seems very focused on her work. And Grace, over the years, having been the wife of Ted Chapman and having all this money at her disposal, she's sort of developed into this society lady who has the best clothes and great contacts and all of that. So she's initially looking at Beth like, I'm not really worried about it. She loves the fact that Beth is dedicated and, always looking to see how she can help out and make things easier for the Chapmans and everything. And for a while, everything works great for Grace. She gets to do her job. She has a weight lifted off of her. She's developing a friendship, an honest friendship with Beth, or at least she thinks. And then these little things start happening where all of a sudden Beth's overall look, her way of dressing, isn't quite so dowdy. She loses, a sweater here, or maybe wears a brighter color there. It's teeny tiny little changes at first, and then all of a sudden she gets a haircut that's very similar to Grace's. And when people start pointing it out, at first Grace is like, well, I'm flattered that she looks up to the way I dress. And then Beth's dress, the way she puts outfits together, it turns almost a little too much like Grace, and then Grace starts to get a little bit weirded out, but she's like, still, maybe there's no harm in it. Until the point it gets to where Grace starts noticing that Beth is actually wearing Grace's clothes. That things in her closet are going missing, and then they mysteriously show up on Beth, and then when she addresses her about it, it's like, oh, I thought this was Goodwill. You told me to donate a bunch of clothes, so I thought, it was up for grabs. And Grace will try to say, no, that particular item was never in Goodwill. And she always finds a way to excuse Beth, or Beth finds a way to talk herself out of this sticky situation to where they're friends again. And it's just this back and forth that goes on for a while in the story. But behind the scenes, Beth is sort of developing this other story around Grace, where it's explained in the story that Grace comes from a history of having a bipolar parent, being raised by a bipolar parent. So that's one of Grace's fears in the back of her mind, is she's always worried that one day she's going to prove unstable, and people are going to be looking at her and saying, oh, well, there she is, that's just like her mom. Beth hears about this, and so she plays off of that, and so she starts working into Grace's paranoias and phobias and things. And then the more time Beth spends with Ted, the more she starts working on him and saying, oh, I don't think she's acting quite stable, or do you notice these little changes in her mood? And throughout this whole time, like I said, Beth's way of dressing and her demeanor, the way she's speaking, it's becoming, as you go through the chapters, it's becoming more and more confident and sexualized and just like overtly amped up with femininity. And Ted goes from just having this assistant in the background to, damn, who's this hottie? And so he gets progressively more and more distracted by Beth and starts putting more weight in what she's saying, until the point to where Grace gets committed by Ted in a I forget what they call it, like the 72-hour hold. I'm forgetting the term for it, but when they give you a 72-hour hold for if you're feeling like suicidal or otherwise, mentally unstable, you can go to the psych department in the hospital where you can do either a 24-hour or 72-hour hold. He sets her up in one of those, and she's trying to fight all this, going, I'm not crazy. And then Grace gets set up with a therapist within the hospital system. And the therapist in this story is just disturbing. If you read about this guy in real life, you would think this guy immediately needs to have his license taken away. But I'm sure there are therapists out there like this, where Grace is trying to honestly give her voice to this guy that, is supposed to be a trusted medical professional. And she's trying to voice her concerns and explain to the best of her ability what's going on, what she thinks is going on. And it's one of those situations where the doctor has pretty much made up his mind before she even says anything. And he immediately starts throwing these medications on her. And when she starts looking things up online and reading about what he actually wants her to take, she starts getting concerned, because she goes back to him and she says, yeah, I was reading about some of these medications you give me, and some of them have adverse effects when you put these together. And he's initially like, oh, don't worry about it, you're not trained for that, don't read online, just take these, don't ask questions kind of attitude. And so she believes him and she goes through it, and it doesn't really help her. Her problems don't go away. In fact, they get compounded. And on top of getting more and more paranoid and depressed and all of these things, she also develops binge eating disorder from the different medications. So he gives her more medications to fix the binge eating disorder on top of what he already had her on. So she just ends up in this huge spiral. And she basically has to figure out a way for her to get out of it herself. Big bulk of the story is her trying to fight her way back to her sanity and basically go and confront Beth again and try to get her life back. So that's pretty much the bulk of the thriller aspect. Now, when I read the synopsis of this, I had this picture that it was going to be much more like Hand That Rocks the Cradle type story, but it felt like it was trying to amp up to that, but it was one of those books that just never quite got there. I don't know if it's because, when I looked over, when I decided I wanted to try Jane Green, I looked over a lot of the books she had. A lot of them did seem sort of like that fluffy beach read type story. And I don't know if it's something where she's used to writing that kind of story, and if she wanted to switch over to something more suspenseful, maybe she's just not used to writing in a suspense format, so maybe it didn't quite take. I don't know. But I kept waiting for this story to get there, and it just never quite did. There are some really cool aspects to this story, though. I do like the questions it raises about mental illness and the thoughts and fears you have with that. That was one thing that kept me reading this story, is reading her experiences about being this child that's being raised by a bipolar parent, and what that does to your mind and the unsettled feelings it leaves you with. Because I myself had a bipolar parent that through most of my life, my dad was largely untreated for it, or he was over medicated for it. He never quite really got his symptoms balanced that often. So it led to a very unsettled home for most of my childhood. My early years were not, I'd say up to like the age of like 8 or so, were not too bad. And then from about 9 on to my teen years, I distinctly remember most days being very unsettled because we never knew what kind of mood he was going to be in day to day. Every day you had to start over and be like, is he approachable today? And that's a very uncomfortable living situation for a child to try to work their head around. But that's something she brings up, the main character brings up in this book, is living in that environment of feeling unsure and unstable, and then also the fear when you grow up with one or both parents who have their own mental health struggles, depending on how bad it is, when you fear if you're going to end up in that same boat, if you don't know how much they pass down to you, if you're going to be unhinged at a certain age. These are valid fears that, with my own experience, both my brother and I have had these conversations where we've gone through our lives worried that at some point we were going to reach that point. I've since gotten to the point where I don't really worry about that as much. I feel like if something was going to happen to the level that my dad had it would have happened by now. So I like to think for the most part I'm in the clear, that I came out relatively stable considering the environment I grew up in. But there are certain symptoms I see in myself, as far as I do notice I have slight tendencies towards the mania end of bipolar disorder. Not so much the severe mood swings from like moment to moment. I do stay pretty stable in my moods for the most part, as long as there's not like a major trigger somewhere during the day. Just my normal being stays pretty stable most days. I do have highs and lows, but they're manageable. They're nothing like what I grew up around. But I do notice more quietly that I do have some tendencies towards the mania end of things, as far as like I do work through OCD, and I mean like true OCD. I don't mean like I need to clean all the time. Like I mean like I do have tendencies towards having a system. Like I do have patterns I have to do, and checking doors and windows and light switch flicking and those types of things that you see within patterns. Like I do have to live with those types of things, but it's still to a point where it's manageable for me, at least for now. But this book brings up a lot of those questions and concerns and things you have to live with when you get raised in that environment, and how it affects you into adulthood. So I did like that aspect of it. And also it brings up the end of, when you try to take this mixed up mind you have and you try to take it to a therapist, and going through the various therapy sessions and what those can be like, healthy and unhealthy. Because you're not guaranteed a great therapist. It's just you have to sort of go in and see what happens, and you either click with a therapist or you don't. But this story does work all of that in there. It also gets into food disorders and the mindset that goes along with that. When she gets into binge eating disorders, and she starts talking about the unsettled issues you have in your mind as a female when your body starts to change, if you're used to being smaller and you get bigger. To a point, I did understand the character of Grace, where she was coming from, because in the story, I don't think she gives actual sizes that I can remember, but just going off of the descriptions that Jane Green does, I feel like Grace starts around the size of maybe a 4, and then I think at the peak of her binge eating disorder, I think she doesn't ever talk about, you know, the struggles of having to go to plus size or anything. It seems like in the story she always is able to find stuff off the rack at any given store, so I would assume that that means that she never really gets any bigger than like a 12, maybe a 14. But even so, having been that span of sizes myself, I've been down to a 4, I've been up to a 14, I've never been beyond a 14. I've been on like the low end of 14 is the biggest I've ever been in my life. So I understand like what that does to you mentally when you see yourself at those 2 different sizes, and what that does when you don't feel comfortable in your body. 'Cause like currently with the different health crap I have going on, my weight right now does fluctuate. It rides somewhere. Sorry about that. The last time I was doing this video, my battery cut out, so I had to wait for the battery to charge and come back to this discussion. So I think where I left off was I was talking about Grace in this story, how she starts this beginning of the story somewhere around, like, I'm guessing like a size 4. I mean, like US. I don't think actual sizes are discussed in the story. I'm just going by the way the character describes herself. She, at the beginning of the story, talks about how she loves being small and she can fit into practically any designer. But she doesn't get comments necessarily in the beginning of the story about her being like too thin. It's just like, oh, you know, you're like desirably thin. So I'm guessing, you know, probably around a size 4, the way people talk about her and the way she describes herself. And then later on, once she goes through all of the traumatic experiences of being, I don't want to say like institutionalized, but I guess put on one of those mental health holds, lockdowns. When she starts going through all that and her therapist starts putting her on all the medication and she starts developing binge eating disorder, her size starts to go up from the combination of meds and depression and all of these things. She starts talking about how it's getting harder and harder to find clothes as the story goes on. She never really talks about, the character never really talks about going into plus sizes or, you know, not being able to buy off the rack. So I'm assuming that she never really gets above like maybe a size 12, I would guess, because she's still going into stores and apparently finding stuff off the rack. It's just she maybe has to find stuff with a little bit more elastic in the waist as opposed to button fly or something like that, which is throughout the story progressively aggravating her more and more. And my issue with Grace is that I can understand her frustration to a point, because as she goes from like a size 4 or 5 up to like a 12, 14, I've run all of those sizes myself. I've never been bigger than a 14 in my life, but below that, I've run everything else. I've been down to a size 5 up to a size 14, or like, you know, bordering on 14, been like a low 14. And I understand the frustration of like when you go through that significant of a body shift. Because when you get used to being tiny and then something happens in your life and your weight starts to creep up, it is a little bit of a shock to your mind and your ego, and it's just, it's a little upsetting at first when you're used to, I think it just comes from you seeing your body one way and then all of a sudden it doesn't look like that anymore one day. And so I understand her frustration and her being upset from that point. It's just the way the character was, I felt like Grace took it a little far at times. With this particular storyline, you know, when your husband's having you committed and things like that, it seems like there are bigger problems than you getting above a designer size. And she just seemed more focused on the fact that she was putting on weight rather than figuring out what was going on in her mind and how to combat these people that were trying to put her away. And I think that was my big issue with Grace, is that her priorities seemed off to me. She was talking about how she couldn't fit in her pretty clothes anymore, and she, at one point, she even complains that she has to go to drugstore makeup instead of her beloved Chanel. And it's just like, girl, it's just, okay, I understand you have your likes, but people are trying to have you committed. It's like, I don't know, maybe use some CVS lipstick for a little bit. It's okay. It's like, you know, Target comes out with some perfectly fine stuff sometimes. It's okay. It's just, that's kind of what killed the story for me, is her constantly harping on this weight thing and like having to go away from designer labels. And Grace is a English character that came over to the US when she married her husband, and then when the problems start happening in the US, she decides to go back to England for a time and sort of like gather herself again. And in that time, she reconnects with somebody from her childhood, a male figure. And this guy, because these days, you know, you can't write anything without putting some sort of romance into it, right? So this guy comes back into her life and says, you know, I always had a crush on you, and you always sort of blew me off, and you were more interested in my brother. And she's like, oh, well, you know, you were cute, but yeah, I guess I didn't really notice. And then she's talking about her problems and everything, and how she feels gross in her body and all this stuff. And he's like the guy that you would want to have in your corner at that time. You know, he's building her up and saying, you look amazing. He's like, I actually like you with a little bit fuller face. You know, he's like, I always thought you were pretty, but he's like, at times I did think you were running a little thin. You know, I actually like you at this shape. He's saying these things and trying to build her up and express his interest. And it's not just like he wants to get in bed with her. He honestly wants to be friends with her, have a relationship with her, you know, have that opportunity she didn't give him before. And the whole time she's just almost acting like, oh great, now I've attracted this guy that has a fat fetish. And it's just, she ended up really aggravating me, Grace. And also the thriller element of the story kind of fell short for me. I think I mentioned this in the earlier part of the video. I forget now since I'm filming this on a different day, but like I went into this story kind of expecting or hoping for a Hand That Rocks the Cradle kind of aspect, and it didn't really get that thriller-ish for me, or psychological for me. I mean, it felt like it was trying to go there. It felt like it was tiptoeing into that territory, but it never quite got there for me. But I think I liked this story more for the mental health issues it brings up, and the dangers of being overly medicated, and having doctors that aren't listening to you as a patient and just want to brush it off and give you a bunch of meds, and having people in your life other than your doctor, just your friends or your spouse or whoever, also them dismissing what you're trying to tell them, the fears and discomfort that comes from that. And yeah, like all the mental health aspect I think I really liked in this story, but a lot of other elements it really fell short for me. It had a really slow build. It also had a pretty lame ending, I thought. for where it was going. I was like, oh, what? Just gonna put it there, huh? We're just gonna close it right there. And then also, one thing that bothered me was there's never really any follow-up with what happened with Ted, her husband. There's the way the story closes, it's one of those ones where you have the main closing scene and then it's a follow-up some months later. And it's like we know what happens to her and her family and friends circle, but Ted sort of drops off the map a few chapters from the end, and you're not really told what happened to him after all of this, like the aftermath and the confrontation with Beth, I think her name was. Yeah, when Grace and Beth have their final confrontation towards the end of the story, and you know, you hit the climax and all that. You never find out what happens to Ted between these two women. It's like he scurries off to the curtain or something, and I don't know, that sort of bothered me. I was just like, okay, we have one character you haven't wrapped up. I will say there is some suspense in this story. It's not completely flat. It's just, it takes like 160 pages to get there. Roughly, and I think this book is under 400, so it's like, it's kind of a wait for anything to kick in. Something about this story though that, like, while it seemed problematic in book form, I could kind of see it working pretty well in film form. So it might be an interesting take if anybody at some point decides to make some sort of movie out of this. There's potential, I guess you would say. Okay, so moving on from that, the other one I have is Mr. Maybe. This one is a little bit more lighthearted, a lot more lighthearted fluff business, but there's also, whoops, that's good. Hold on. There's also some good, cute stuff in here, but again, we have some problematic characters. So basically, Mr. Maybe is the story of this girl, Libby. It's been a little bit since I've read these, so I gotta remind myself the character names. Libby is sort of like a publicist to celebrities in London. Jane Green is a UK author, that's why a lot of her books are set there. So she's a UK celebrity publicist, and she's worked really hard, worked her way through the ranks to get to the position she's in, where she's making pretty good money for herself, able to take care of herself just fine. But she's getting to that point in her life where she's like, you know what, I worked really hard to get this far. I don't know if I want to work that hard the rest of my life. So she gets the idea that, you know, instead of like really keeping at this pace of work and maybe having a nice retirement one day, I think I just want to marry well at this point, because I think when the story starts, she's like 28, 29, so she's hitting that wall where she feels like she has to nail down a husband. So she said, you know, why not a really rich one? So she decides that she's going to set herself to specifically finding a wealthy husband to bag. And almost right off the bat, her plans get derailed because she meets Nick. She goes out with friends one night and just by chance runs into this guy, Nick, who happens to have mutual friends with her. And they get in a conversation at the pub or a nightclub or something like that, and almost immediately hit it off just perfectly. They have instant attraction with each other. They both find each other incredibly good looking, really interesting to talk to. They vibe off of each other really well. And I think it's like that night or the next day, and I'm pretty sure it's that night, their first night, they meet. They end up at Libby's place, I think, and have the most amazing sex of her dating experience. And she's like, oh my god, this is amazing. And then she gets to know more about Nick, and she starts to find out that he is the absolute wrong candidate for the plan she had going for her to bag a rich husband. Because while Nick is really charismatic, really good looking, interesting, very kind and all of that, he is also an unemployed writer, an aspiring writer on unemployment, living off of unemployment payments, which is, like I said, the exact opposite direction of where she wanted to go with her potential mate. But after thinking about it for a little bit, I think in the story she's mainly driven by the great sex she's having with him, but she said, you know what, maybe I can put that plan on hold just for a little bit and have some fun with him and see where this goes. And I don't think she really intends for it to get really serious. But she said, you know, maybe it might be fun to have one last little boyfriend before I get really serious about the husband. But Nick tells her right off the bat. It is Nick, right? Yeah. I want to make sure I have these characters straight. Nick tells her right off the bat, I'm not looking for a girlfriend. I'm not looking for a relationship. I'm down for flings, down for friends with benefits, but absolutely not wanting anything serious right now. And he tells her very point blank he's not in a space in his life to handle any sort of serious commitment because he really wanted to get his writing career off the ground, which I had a little bit of issue with him saying that because one, I've heard that speech many times in my past, and two, I always felt, even back then, if you are with the right person, you meet the right person, all of that other stuff is bullshit. Point blank. You will find time to be with the person if you are really interested in them. Because I've dated people with crazy work schedules. I married a firefighter. We found time to be together if we wanted to be together. So when you have the person you're seeing saying, oh, well, you know, I'm trying to pursue this thing, and I don't know. I tend to call bullshit on that because, you know, I've dated people that have gone through med school, EMT school, all of it, law school. I've dated people that have had crammed schedules, and we always found time to go out with each other. It might not be every day. It might be a few days, but they find time for you if they want to be with you. So I think he's just, you know, still in that space where he just wants to have as many opportunities as possible. He just doesn't want like a set girlfriend right now. But he is attracted to Libby, does find her a lot of fun. So they start hanging out, and from the bat they say, oh yeah, it's going to be casual. And I know from the bat that Libby's going to get herself in trouble because I've also been in that situation where you're like, oh yeah, like you go in thinking you're going to be like maybe semi-serious with this person or semi-committed, and then they tell you the speech of they don't want that much, and you're like, oh, it's fine, no, it's great. Yeah, I'm cool with that too. Yeah, I used to do that in my early 20s, and I'll tell you right now, somebody, one or the other person, almost always ends up taking it further than you intended, emotionally, and someone always ends up crying or getting mad or saying, I thought we had an understanding. So when I'm starting this story and seeing where she's taking it, I'm like, oh, no. I know where this is going. But you have to let characters go with it, though, because they're fictional and the writer has to take you where it has to go. So I'm sort of like doing the mental, you know, hand over the face cringing, no, but go ahead, I want to see it happen, thing with Libby's love life. And she goes on, they start dating a little bit, and they say it's not serious, but you see pretty quickly that they're acting like a couple. They're doing little couple things, like going to the park, and they go to functions together, and they hang out with friends together. And the thing that bugged me about Nick during all of this is, even though at the beginning he stated right off the bat that he didn't want a girlfriend, didn't want anything serious, which at that point I respected him for putting it all out on the line right there and getting that out of the way. What bothered me later was that while he said that in the beginning, he does all these things later that are sort of boyfriend material things, or behaviors of, remembering little things she likes, or hanging out with friends and giving her little kisses on the forehead, or holding her hand and rubbing the inside of her palm, and all of these things, and like all of these like intimate little things that you have when you're in a committed relationship, but they're not really what you would tend to find with somebody that you're just sleeping with casually. So down to the moment of them having their confrontation later, where feelings have gotten too far, and they're struggling with each other. I got a little upset with him because he's giving her this speech of, I told you up front what I wanted, and I'm like, yeah, but you acted like a boyfriend though, so can you understand where her mind maybe got confused? Maybe she thought you were changing your mind and she's just trying to roll with it. And oh God, I'm so glad I'm out of the dating years. So I'm trying to keep my husband healthy so I don't have to go back to that. No, that's my train of thought. But yeah, they get to a point where Nick all of a sudden, after the days, weeks of being really affectionate and close with her, and everything seems perfect, he gets to a point where he's like, no, I have to pull the plug on this. You're getting too invested, and you're too good a girl. I don't want to hurt you, and basically shatters her heart right there. So they break up. She goes off by herself, and then a few weeks later on the rebound, she meets this guy, Ed McMahon, which is funny to me as an American, because Ed McMahon was sort of a celebrity host figure back in the 80s, early 90s in the US. And I kept picturing that face when she's talking about this investment banker she meets, because I can't get the picture out of like Star Search Ed McMahon out of my head. And I was like, well, yeah, I wouldn't really want to sleep with him either. But I know that's like a made up name from the UK perspective of Jane Green, but I just thought it was a funny connection over here. But anyway, Libby goes on to get sort of reluctantly in this relationship with Ed McMahon, who is an investment banker, again, meeting through mutual friends, I think. It's a similar situation to how she met Nick, where they were all just hanging out with friends, and she falls into a conversation with Ed. And at first she's just thinking, oh, they had a nice conversation, and he asks her out for dinner one night, and she's just sort of casually like, oh, yeah, we should do that sometime. And doesn't expect anything of it, doesn't really think about him again until he starts calling her repeatedly. And then she's like, wow, this guy is like really invested in this dinner. And she blows him off for a while until she starts hearing stories from her friends when she mentions that she was asked out by this guy, and they're like, oh my God, how did you get a date with him? And she's like, why? Was he something special? Because all she can think of is that he wasn't that great looking. He had a weird mustache that turned her off. She said it seemed nice enough. We had a decent conversation, but it was definitely more friend vibe. But her friends are like, no, he's like a serious eligible bachelor. He has all kinds of money. People have been trying to get with him for years, but nobody's been able to get anywhere with him. So once she hears that, she suddenly becomes all that more interested and said, oh yeah, maybe I should call him up on this date. And so they go on the first date, and it's not amazing. It's kind of like their first conversation. He seems nice enough, but she's not really attracted to him, but she keeps agreeing to go out with him over the sort of like second half of the book. And so before she knows that she's in a relationship with him, and then all of a sudden he's proposing, and she's not really all that more into him through all this time. But once she sees like his amazing apartment in the city, and thinking about how she's going to be his missus, and she's going to be in all the social society papers and everything, she's like, I don't know, maybe I could be down for this. So she goes along with it and agrees to get engaged. But the rest of the story from there is her fighting with this of whether she really wants this. Does she really want to have this security and this money, but not really be interested in her husband? Or does she want to go and drop all this and go after somebody that she's actually really emotionally invested in? It's just that, you know, timeless story of choosing love versus security. Because it's rare that many people get both. Most people, you got to go with one or the other. At least in the beginning, there are plenty of couples that work their way up from love into love and security, but a lot of us start with either one or the other. Either getting a relationship for money or for the relationship itself. And she just can't shake Nick out of her mind. And so she doesn't know what to do, because on one hand, Ed is offering her everything she thought she wanted, but then, you know, when you can't get a specific person out of your mind, you're thinking that's got to mean something, right? But then he said he didn't want anything, so she figures that's a dead end. Until, of course, by novel magic, Nick sort of comes back into her circle through, I forget, they have some like function or something where they run into each other again, and then it sort of brings them together and they start having these conversations again. And that's the basic premise of the story, is like, which way does she choose? And it's it's not super deep, obviously, the novel, but it brings up some good points. If you're around my age, you know, late 30s, established married lady, all that, it'll maybe make you a little bit nostalgic for your earlier dating years. Just like the funny, stupid, nightmarish things you go through that you look back on nostalgically, even though I'm not talking about nightmare as far as like, you know, assault or anything. I'm talking about like comedic nightmare of like, oh my God, that was the most embarrassing, worst date ever kind of thing. But the stuff you laugh about now, but you sat through all those years back, it'll kind of maybe make you a little bit nostalgic for those years and that innocence and everything. But it also make you appreciate how great it is to get to the point where you finally find that person that just is the right fit. Because reading her go through these guys that are not the right fit is just awkward and uncomfortable and cringy. And it's not necessarily 100% the guy's fault. I mean, she kind of has her issues with Nick because he leads her on, and then with Ed, she sort of leads Ed on. It's just, there are a lot of guilty parties in the story, and I felt bad for Ed through a lot of it, because in the beginning of their relationship, I think Ed maybe feels that something is off, but he's really trying. He is really dedicated to her, tries to figure out what she wants, tries to give it to her. There's some comedic scenes where they talk about how the sex is just really off between her and Ed. It's just, he's really fumbly, he's awkward and unsure of himself, but he's, you know, enthusiastic, I guess. He's a little bit on the teenage boy spectrum of things mentally. But she never communicates this to him, though. That was my problem with her, is she just gets mad at him but never says what's going wrong, and he's just trying to figure it out, and until she finally just blurts it out that, like, you're terrible in bed, like really bad. And he gets upset naturally, because that's a little bit of a crush to the ego. Nobody wants to hear that, but he was like, all right, okay, cool. Let's do something about it. And so poor Ed goes to the bookstore and buys a copy of The Joy of Sex and just reads it cover to cover, because that's the type of person he is. He's very literal minded, very linear thinking, saying, oh, okay, we have a problem, I need to fix it. let's go find a manual for it. And there's nobody really there to help him to explain that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So he reads the book cover to cover like it's a refrigerator manual, and then just goes like step 1, step 2, step 3 through the next moment of them having sex. And she says the first time around it's not bad, it's better from what he was doing, but then like when they go to do it again, she realizes he's repeating the exact same steps in the exact same order, and then it happens again, and she's like, oh god, here we go. And then she doesn't know how to break it to him of like, okay, well, you have to mix things up and you have to, you know, do different things in different orders at least. And so it was a little bit hard to read that, thinking from like, you know, just tell him, just explain it, just like, because I've always been of the mind of like, if you can't talk about sex, you don't need to be doing it. If you can't talk about body parts, you don't need to be touching them, be inside them, nothing. It's just, you have to get to that point where you're okay to talk about those things and then go on. So I felt really bad for Ed, because he was like, damn it, just what am I doing wrong? Because I had a similar experience with my husband. Not that, I'm not saying that my husband was bad in bed at all. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm saying my husband had a very emotionally traumatic experience in his first marriage that made him a little bit unsure of himself when we started dating. So when we first started getting intimate, there were times where it was a little bit awkward and fumbly, because he had a relationship before that had crushed him, his spirit emotionally. And so when he approached me, he wanted to make me happy, but he still had that critiquing voice of the ex in his head telling him, you know, he was garbage and all this. So it was a process of us learning each other and me reassuring him, you're fine, you're doing okay, there's nothing wrong. Because there wasn't anything wrong. It was just, I knew right off the bat that it was just, he needed some assurance and he needed some, you know, self-esteem built back up again. And we're good now. He's amazing now. So it's just communication of like, you know, if you have something that's off, just say it. It's, if you can't be intimate with the person you share a bed with, who are you gonna be intimate with? So just it should be cool to just be like, okay, little note, if we could do this a little bit different. So I kept wanting that for Ed, but then I kind of fell off Team Ed later when there was a moment where she was trying more in the relationship. Libby was trying more in the relationship, and she set up this dinner for their families to meet and everything. And when they leave the party, they're driving home, and in the car, Ed basically just eviscerates everybody on Libby's side. Her friends, her family, saying how terrible they are and how embarrassing they are, and well, I guess you'll just, you know, not have to interact with any of your friends again once we're married, and we'll have to get you a new circle of friends. And she's like, whoa, wait, what? And that's exactly what I did the moment it happened. I was like, that's definitely not somebody you get involved with, is anybody that's like, okay, you have to drop this friend from your life. Because again, I've been there too. And it took me a long time to get out of that relationship where this guy was telling me, you know, you can only hang out with these people I approve. And yeah, after that I was like, oh, no, Ed, you can get stuck with whatever. No. Because of the subject matter, there are parts in here that do get slightly sexually explicit. So if you're sensitive to that, there are some passages in here where organs are mentioned pretty explicitly, but it's not to the point of being just like overtly graphic, because I mean it's still a fluff piece. But yeah, not super deep. Fun for what it is. Good beach read kind of thing. I don't know. I haven't found, I think these two, I haven't quite found one that's a Jane Green novel that I'm like really in love with just yet. But we'll keep trying, right? I think, see, I had a sticky note on here to share one passage with you before I go. And it's what I wrote, Libby's perceived issue with Nick. When she meets Nick and she finds this person that seems perfect for her on every level except financial, and she's explaining why that's enough for her to question whether she needs to pursue this further. So she's talking to her friend, and her friend Jules says, I don't know why you keep saying there's no future in it. You seem perfect together. And she said, that's your first impression, Jules. You don't know him. So her friend says, so what do I need to know? He's handsome, obviously bright, and you seem to get on really well. What's the problem? And so then she goes on to say, how can I explain what the problem is? How can I tell her that I couldn't marry Nick because how would we live? I'd never be able to give up work, and our children would have to go to local comprehensive where they'd probably get into the wrong crowd and end up taking drugs and hanging out in gangs. Dear God, send them to public school of all things. How can I tell her that my idea of hell would be to end up a harassed mother who had to try and be the breadwinner as well as bringing up the kids? That I'm always looking a complete mess because I wouldn't have time or the money to make an effort. The designer clothes would be something I'd only wear if somebody like Jules took pity on me and gave me some hand-me-downs. And that I'd have to say goodbye to designer restaurants and bars I'd love so much. And on the rare occasion we went out for dinner, it would have to be somewhere cheap and cheerful. This is also where I was like, you know what, you get, with that attitude, you get what you get. If you find somebody that's perfect for you and all you can think is you're going to lose your chance to wear designer clothes and go out to overpriced restaurants, then yeah, you get what you get. But going on. Actually, a lot of it doesn't sound so bad, but I know I'm talking myself into believing that it's not so bad because I'm growing to like Nick more and more, and I'm trying to compromise to change my lifestyle to fit into his because I have no other choice. Very traumatic. In fact, I haven't even been to a bloody designer restaurant or bar since before I met Nick. And okay, it's true, I don't miss him that much, but I wouldn't want to spend the rest of my life knowing that I couldn't go to them because I couldn't afford it. I may not be going now, but that's their choice. So how can I explain this to Jules when I know she wouldn't understand, particularly given that she's met Nick on her territory when he's dressed up in clothes he never normally wears to fit in. And yes, he does fit in, but if she saw him on his territory with his friends doing what he likes to do, I'm sure she'd take my point. She'd have to, wouldn't she? It's too long to go into, I say, but I'm telling you, it's just a fling. Bullshit. She looks at me. You're my best friend, Libby, and I know you better than anyone else in the world. You will be able to get away with telling other people that you don't care about him, that it's just sex, but you look at you, for God's sake, you're crazy about him. What makes you say that? She sighs. It's the way you look at him, the way your face lights up every time he says something, the way you hang on his every word. Don't worry, she says, seeing the dismay on my face. I don't think he knows, but I do. What do you think he thinks of me? I can't help asking. My insecurity raises its ugly head. She shrugs. It's much harder to tell with men, but my guess is he probably feels the same way. The only thing that worries me is that he did say at the beginning that he wasn't looking for a relationship, and I think you have to remember that because you've definitely fallen for him. He may well have fallen for you too, but if the timing's wrong, then you might just get hurt. Timing. Jules is a big believer in timing. She always says that Jamie and she met at exactly the right time, that had it been any earlier, she wouldn't have been ready for a relationship, not even with the gorgeous Jamie. She looks at me closely and can see that what she's said has upset me, and her voice softens as she says, Look, Libby, I don't want to see you hurt, and I think he probably does feel the same way about you, but you have to be aware that when men say they're not ready for a relationship, 9 times out of 10, it means they're not ready for a relationship. And even if you're the most wonderful woman in the world, it's not going to change their minds. But, she adds, almost to herself, there are always women who can change their minds, I suppose. And that's what I needed to hear. And as soon as she says the words, I make a decision. I'm going to be the woman who changes his mind. Except I don't share this secret with Jules because it's going to be my own little secret. And again, I was just left shaking my head because even though I've been there, I can tell you now from experience, just let it go. Don't try to be the girl that's going to change them. I think you'd have better luck if you're just you, and by being you, just being you normally on an everyday basis, not trying to do anything different, just you existing as you always are, if that happens to change them, if they happen to be drawn enough into your presence the way you are, if that motivates them enough to change themselves, that's great. But don't go for a project guy. Don't make them a project. It's just, because you know what happens? You always end up with a guy that isn't what you fell in love with. And it's just a mess, and it's a disappointment, and you get mad and they get mad. Just find somebody that you're really into right off the bat. That if you meet them, ask yourself, are you cool with them being like that the rest of their life? If that happens, are you cool with the possibility that that's who they're going to be the rest of their life? I mean, yeah, they could change. They could evolve their interests. They could get into other things and, you know, maybe turn into somebody a little bit different, whatever, down the road. But just when you meet them, ask if you see them like this every day and this is their situation, if this is their mental state, if this is their financial situation, whatever it is, everything about them right in that moment when you meet them and you decide you really like them, then if you are thinking about a relationship with them, just think, can you handle them like that for the rest of your life? And if you're okay with them at that point, then yeah, maybe just pursue them that way and accept who they are in that moment. Let them be who they are. Don't go and try to, you know, make them get rid of all their stuff and change their wardrobe and say, you're into these things now. No, let them be. When I first met Barry, it's sort of a joke between us now, but when I first met Barry, one of the things I thought was really funny about him is virtually everything in his closet was some version of gray, or like speckled gray, mottled gray shirt. Even his fun shirts, his sweatshirts, everything was gray. And then he had some blue jeans. And that was basically like his uniform. And previously I had dated guys who were really into clothes and had a lot of dress shirts and, you know, liked dressing up for events and things like that. And so when I first started dating Barry, it was a little bit of a shock because I'm like, there is virtually no color in your wardrobe. And he was like, I just never thought about it because he's a firefighter. He's in his uniform virtually every day of the week. He has like most of the time he has like maybe 2 or 3 days off during the week. The rest of the time he's in his uniform blues or his turnout gear. And so he said he never really thought about what his actual personal style preference was. He just wore what fit or what had a design he liked. And at first I was like, because we met when I was, I think we started dating when I was 25. I think I had just turned 25. And I was just, you know, I'm a lot more sort of artsy minded. My husband is very linear, has very sort of, I mean, he's a fire department engineer, so he runs truck pumps for a living. So there's a lot of math that goes into getting that degree. He has an actual fire technology degree, and I've seen his textbooks. There was a lot of math in there that I don't want to do. I wouldn't get into. But that's the way his mind works. And I was thinking, when I first met him, I was thinking, are we gonna work? Because I didn't know if he was gonna be like so straight-laced that I was like, is he not gonna be any fun? But he does have a fun side to him. It's just it took a matter of time to convince him that it's okay to let it out. Because there's also sort of an element that develops in the fire department where you can be one way with the guys at the station, but you have to be another way around women because they're worried that they're going to come off as too crude or offensive. So a lot of them tend to water down their humor or closet it and be like the good guy in public. And it took Barry a while to understand that I'm okay with that. It's just be you. And over the years, you know, I've found little things for him, as far as like clothes and things like that, that incorporate his more colorful side, his more fun side, and he's developed that over the years. But I never told him he had to get rid of any of that. I never told him, you know, one of his hobbies is he collects Transformers. He still plays video games. I never told him he had to get rid of that. He has a gaming room right next to this room where he has all of his video games and his Transformers and all of that stuff set up, and that's his thing. That's his space. And I never took that away from him. I never said he had to get rid of his gray clothes. It's just, as his wife, I incorporate colors every once in a while of colors I think he looks good in. I'll gift him certain things, and over time he's developed more of a taste of colors he likes on himself and that kind of thing. So, I mean, you get to learn the person, but you don't change them. I never took away anything that he was comfortable with about himself. So I guess that's my my message at the end of this. So that's what I have for this video. I rambled on so much about this, so I just wanted to wrap this up. And yeah, I have now experienced Jane Green for all those who recommended her to me. Like I said, still haven't found one that I'm really in love with just yet, but I will keep trying down the road. So thanks for watching this far, and we will talk soon. Bye, guys.